Now we hear from Prisca, also known as Priscilla, who is living in Corinth. She writes this: "The winds of the sea blow eastward mostly. Don't we know this, Aquila and I, from our own experience? We flew, it felt like flying, across the Adriatic at the start of our voyage to Corinth. But then we had to fight our way south, down the coast of Macedonia and Achaia. In the Gulf of Corinth, our vessel took flight again to the east. On the other side of Corinth lies the Saronic Gulf, where the eastward wind blows stiff in spring and contrary to the westward traveler. About 6 months after we had come from the west, Paul the Apostle wanted to come from the east, from Athens. The winter storms had finished their bluster, ships were sailing again, but on account of the wind and the chancy seas, he chose to travel to Corinth on foot. He wanted the independence, to trust the trip to himself alone. He was anxious. Alone he was, and lonely too, I think. He worried so much for his baby church in Thessalonica that he had sent Timothy north to look out for them. He was weak, too, physically. The poor man had never quite recovered from a collapse he had suffered in Galatia. Well, and the Romans had beat him in Philippi. Some of these details Paul told me himself a long while later. Some I saw for myself when we first met in Corinth. Some I'm guessing. But maybe no one knows him better than I do, so I'm a pretty good guesser. I don't think Paul wanted to spend more than 2 days traveling. So that first day out of Athens was a very long day. He took the sacred way to Eleusis, about 14 miles, where he sat down and ate figs. Then he followed the Saronic coastline, another 12 miles, as far as Megara. He slept on a leather sheet in a grove of olive trees. Right away, the second day, Paul had to go 5 miles on a narrow track cut directly on the mountainside. On his left was a rocky drop straight down to the sea. On his right, the mountain rose up, lofty and forbidding. This particular stretch of road they call the Scaronian Rocks in memory of Scarion, a robber. They say that Scarion used to make lonely travelers kneel down and wash his feet. Then, just as they were finishing, he'd kick them with his clean foot over the cliff. Paul walked that winding track. He told me, quote, in a stinking sweat, unquote. Not so much for fear of robbers, though they still do lurk in the rugged hills above, but for fear of the drop-off. Heights ruin him, he said. Heights cause in him a strange hankering to creep to the edge, to lean over, to lean till he goes off balance, to fall. His heart hammers at the possibility. That hammering is one part desire and one part terror, that he might actually go and do the idiot thing. I am 2 men striving for the soul of one. Now, I want to tell you as best as I can what happened to Paul at his coming to Corinth. Or perhaps I should say what Paul did. I don't really understand this story, but it feels heavy in my memory. I mean, it wants to be told. As he approached the city that afternoon, even before he had reached the isthmus, Paul lifted his eyes, and for the first time, he saw the Acrocorinth. It rose like royalty over all the land around, and it shut his mouth. That singular rock, that grisly rock, a half-mile high, seized his sight and became for him a destination, almost, I think, a destiny. He traveled the isthmus like a ghost, unaware of anything except that mighty rock before him. Why should this be? I don't know. I don't understand it. These things, though, I do know, that there's a paved road called the Holocross, which connects the 2 sides of the isthmus. that it goes 4 miles from the Saronic Gulf to the east of the Bay of Corinth in the west, that along this road drovers drag the cargoes of ships, and even the ships themselves, on large platforms from sea to sea, and that Paul crossed this road with its shouting men and its straining animals and its ships afloat on dry land, completely oblivious. In Corinth, he couldn't recall a bit of it. He recalled the Acrocorinth, that only. He said that he came to Corinth trembling with weakness. Maybe weakness attached to him and attached him to that immovable rock the way a sick man fixes on a lamp flame in the dark. The rock drew him forward, that's for sure. It gave direction to his step. There are walls on the Acrocorinth, a final refuge if ever the city's besieged. Paul, approaching from the east, watched as though those high and indifferent battlements caught fire from the dying sun. Then the mighty rock itself blackened into silhouette against the canvas of a deep green sky. As he entered the Isthmian gate, now in the dusk of the day, Paul saw lines of torchlight ascending the rock on an incline. He couldn't see the bodies of those who carried the torches, but he saw the route that climbed the rock, a sweeping zigzag pattern. A girdle of fire at the waist of the Acrocorinth, which now seemed to him the more massive than ever, a black dominion pressing breath from the earth. There were temples there, 10 sanctuaries along the road that climbs it. Paul saw the glow of these fires too on the hillside. High up are ancient sacred dining rooms, stone tables and stone benches built for the feasts of Demeter. Highest of all, and hidden in the heights, is the temple of Aphrodite, small as temples go, but surrounded by the cells of votaries and expanded by subterranean chambers, one of which runs deep enough to receive the waters of a natural spring. Paul lay down on his leather sheet in the vineyard at the foot of the rock. Perhaps he slept. If he did, it was fleeting and restless, no longer than an hour or two. He brooded under the weight of the Acrocorinth. It sat, he said, like a throne upon his chest. Hours before dawn, then he got up and folded the leather and hoisted his bags and began to walk in moonlight. All the city was asleep. He walked alone, his sandals grinding gravel. Paul found the road that ascends the rock and began to climb. It starts its ascent on the north side of the city, amid a clutter of Corinthian buildings, then passes through orchards, then grows serious in the climb, sweeping long to the left, long to the right, in the switchbacks that Paul had seen the night before. There were no torches now, no people. He toiled alone. In the cold, he grew warm by climbing. In shadows, he kept his feet upon the grooves the cartwheels carved. The land below him was watery pale with moonlight, but the north side was the dark side of the rock, and he could not always detect where the edge of the road was and the drop-off. Finally, the road ceased switching and climbed directly across the northern face to the great shoulder of the Acrocorinth and around to the western escarpments. Just before he made that turn, Paul saw a firelight far off at the Lycaean port on the Bay of Corinth. Then he lost the sight. He came round to moonlight and to a sinking moon. He came round as well into a sudden howling wind, which tore at the cloak on his shoulders. It wanted to bear his bags away. It blew furiously and did not stop blowing. Above him, the face of the rock gazed silver and black and impassive toward the white moon. Below him, he saw a saddle of land that crossed to another, lower rock. Paul, panting now, tightened his right fist and hit himself on the forehead several times. Hard, driving courage into his soul, he willed himself forward and upward as if the climbing had become a combat. And his will indeed grew fiercer. And yes, he climbed, but his skin raised welts of fright because he was so high. And the path was narrow and sometimes loose and often steep, and he could not hear his footfall. He could not hear his breathing. He heard only the roaring of wind in his ears. But he climbed. There was a respite when he entered a passage banked on both sides by a higher limestone. And then he came over a final rise and found himself in something like a valley filled with shadow. The ground was humped and rugged, but more level than before, and the wind was broken by the higher rock around him. Now the stars were dimming. The depths of the sky were losing their perfect blackness, and in the east the heavens were growing gray before the two highest summits of the Acrocorinth. Paul did not pause in shadow. He made for the northern summit, the higher of the two. He climbed, pathless now, unbroken scree. He used his hands and feet together. He climbed. And the gray sky lightened and the wind screamed up the shingle behind him. Who can understand these compulsions? Paul knew only that he wouldn't be done till he reached the top. Gasping a thin air, his muscles burning from the long exertion, he climbed. On the topmost hummock of land was a heap of rough-hewn stones built altar-like, and on that heap a platform spaced for one man standing and no more. Paul dropped his bags. He removed his cloak and weighed it down with the bags. He crawled up onto the platform from knees to feet. He stood slowly upright. He lifted his eyes, then caught his breath and cried out in terror. In the rude red glow of the morning, Paul was the highest thing on earth. He said to his soul, "A storm is coming." He was terrified of the sky, the place he had entered. Treacherous were the wind and the heavens together, assaulting his body. Down and down on all sides round, he could see the world emerging from darkness, the patchwork pieces that the farmers worked, vineyards, orchards. To the north, the Bay of Corinth and the Ionian Sea and ships at anchor. To the east, the Saronic Gulf and the Aegean laid flat on the earth. Nearer, like pebbles at his feet, the city of Corinth itself. The wind blew, the wind kept blowing, still unbroken. A storm is coming. Paul was cold with morbid sweat. He felt the idiot urge to pitch himself headlong from heaven to earth, but the wind preserved him. So powerfully did the wind strive to throw him down that Paul, enraged by the opposition, found the will to fight it. Rage external destroyed internal urges. He wrestled the wind, and the contest cleansed him, giving focus to his thought and purpose to his person. Suddenly he threw back his head and began to howl. "Jesus Christ, Lord Jesus, mercy, mercy on me. I want to know nothing but you. I want to preach nothing but you. Christ," he wailed, "I want to be nothing but crucified with you. Live in me, Jesus." And immediately Jesus appeared in the wind and said, "Don't be afraid, I'm with you. Nothing shall attack to harm you, and don't be silent. Go down and preach exactly as you say, for I have many people in this city."